As we've talked about so far, the theory of evolution has been embattled from the beginning, and it continues to be so now. And it does so precisely because of how important and consequential it is. When Darwin first published his book, he sent a copy to his former mentor at Cambridge, and the famous geologist Adam Sedgwick, who wrote back and said, "I have read your book with more pain than pleasure. Parts of it I admired greatly, parts of it I laughed at till my sides were sore. Other parts I read with absolute sorrow, because I think them utterly false and grievously mischievous. I cannot conclude without expressing my detestation of the theory, because of its unflinching materialism. There is a moral or metaphysical part of nature as well as a physical. A man who denies this is deep in the mire of folly." And that was from one of Darwin's friends. The 20th century saw even harsher reviews. Here's Henry Morris, who was the founder of creation science, himself a big young earth creationist. He said, "Jesus said, 'A good tree cannot bring forth corrupt fruit.' In view of the bitter fruit yielded by the evolutionary system over the past 100 years, a closer look at the nature of the tree itself is well warranted today." And further, evolution is at the foundation of communism, fascism, Freudianism, social Darwinism, behaviorism, Keynesianism, materialism, and atheism. And he didn't mean any of that as a compliment. But William Jennings Bryan took it even further. Bryan was a very prominent Democratic politician of the time. He was and still is the youngest person to ever get the nomination from a major party to run for president. He was 36 years old. When he first ran for president, he ran 3 times and lost each time. He said, "All the ills from which America suffers, all of them, can be traced back to the teachings of evolution. It would be better to destroy every book ever written and save just the first 3 verses of Genesis." And further, the same science that manufactured poisonous gases to suffocate soldiers, that is what was happening overseas in World War I, is preaching that man has a brute ancestry, that is that man has his roots in the apes and other animals. But even the reviews that were actually positive about evolution were still bad reviews. And what I mean by that is exemplified by this one from Karl Marx. So Marx said, "Darwin's work is most important and suits my purpose in that it provides a basis in natural science for the historical class struggle." The key point there is that it suits my purpose. What all of these reviews have in common is that instead of evaluating evolution on its scientific merits, instead of worrying about whether it's true or not, all of them are rooted in the moral implications of the theory, whether they fit the particular political ideology that the reviewer actually aligns with. And that's a problem, but it's particularly a problem when we look at evolutionary psychology. On the next page, I want to bring something up which is potentially the most important thing that you can learn throughout the entire course, and that's the naturalistic fallacy. So this has its origins in the philosophies of David Hume, who was a big 18th century philosopher, probably the most important philosopher of his era. He identified 2 problems in reasoning, the ought-is problem and the is-ought problem. Those of you who took my 102 class will know this stuff well because I went over and over on it in that class, because it's super important. Basically, what Hume said is that there are facts and there are values, and we shouldn't conflate the 2. We have to recognize that one doesn't determine the other. And when we do that, when we do conflate them, we're making a grievous error. The ought-is problem is when you let the way you think things should be about the world necessarily determine the way you think things actually are in the world. So you have a factual claim about how the world actually is, and you have a moral position, a value position, how you think the world should be, how it ought to be, and you let that moral claim determine what you think is actually true. Now, I'll give you some examples on the next page, but first, let's talk about the inverse, which is the is-ought problem. That's where you let the way that things are in the world determine how you think that they ought to be. You let your factual claim determine your moral claim, determine what you think should be. And there's a subclass of that called the naturalistic fallacy, where your factual claim is about whether something is natural or evolved, and you let that determine whether you think that thing is good or bad. So you could say, well, because X is natural, that means that X is good. Or because Y is evolved, that means it must ought to be that way. Or conversely, if something is unnatural, well, if it's not natural, then it must be a bad thing. So let's go through some examples. Here's one. Men and women should be equal. Therefore, innate differences in ability don't exist. Now, you should be able to spot the logical error there, but let's come back to that. I'll give you a few more. Because it is more natural than cigarettes, it's better to smoke pot. Not only is that a logical fallacy, but it's a grammatic fallacy as well. It's a bad sentence. Men and women evolved to be promiscuous, therefore men and women should cheat. And then one that's not super hard, but maybe harder than the others. Because we evolved to feel that incest is wrong wrong. Okay, let's go back to the first one here. We have to identify what's the should statement, what's the moral statement, and then what's the is statement, that is the fact statement. So the should statement is clear. It has the word should in it. Men and women should be equal. That's the way you think the world ought to be. And in this sentence, you're using the way that you think the world ought to be to conclude that that is the way the world actually is. And that's a fallacy. That is an ought-is problem. You're letting the way that you think the world ought to be determine the way you think the world is. What about the next one? Because it is more natural than cigarettes, it's better to smoke pot. What's your moral claim? What's your should statement? Well, you're saying it's better to smoke. It's better to smoke pot. It's better to smoke pot. And your is statement is that, well, it's because pot is more natural than cigarettes. So you're letting the naturalness of something, the factual naturalness of it, determine the moral position. But one doesn't follow from the other. And that's why that's an is-ought problem. You're letting your is fallaciously determine your ought. And because we're talking about something that's natural and something that's good, that is a naturalistic fallacy. It's part of the subset of is-ought problems that is a naturalistic fallacy. Okay, the third one. Men and women evolved to be promiscuous, therefore men and women should cheat. The moral claim is that men and women should cheat. That's what they ought to do. And you're using as a basis for why they ought to do that, well, because they evolved that way. But that's not a good enough reason to say that that's how they should act. Simply because we evolved some way doesn't mean that we ought to do it from a moral perspective. It might explain why we do tend to do it, but it doesn't mean we should do it. So there again, you have a factual claim about something being natural or evolved, determine a moral claim, and so it is again a naturalistic fallacy. Finally, for the last one, because we evolved to feel that incest is wrong, incest is wrong. Incest is wrong being your moral claim. The justification is because we evolved to feel that way. That's not a good enough reason. That is not a good enough reason to say that something is or is not wrong. We talked about this in one of the discussion sections, that we might have evolved empathy towards those less fortunate than us. And as a result, is that a good enough reason to be good, to help those less fortunate to us? No, that alone is not a good enough reason. We need a moral argument as to why we should help others. We should help those less fortunate. Just because we evolved to feel that way, that's not sufficient justification. And so this again is an is-ought problem, which is a naturalistic fallacy. Now we're going to go over a bunch of these throughout the course. These will appear on the test. We're going to talk about this a lot because these are super important. But for right now, the reason I bring it up is because this determined some of the biggest societal errors that emerged in the wake of evolutionary theory. And that's social Darwinism. Now, this was an idea that was introduced by the British philosopher Herbert Spencer, who was a very prominent philosopher in his day. He actually invented the paperclip. He also coined the term survival of the fittest, which underpins the idea of social Darwinism. But what social Darwinism does is it applies the scientific theory of evolution to how we should organize our policy, our society. Social Darwinism is the normative application of evolutionary ideas to social and public policy. And it is generally characterized by three features. One is the embrace of competition between individuals and classes. In order to realize this idea of the survival of the fittest, if what we see in the law of nature is competition between organisms and that allows for the fit to survive, well, that's what we should make in our society as well. We should have people compete so that the best rise to the top. And what happens to the worst? Well, we should just let them be. Laissez-faire attitudes towards the unfit. Laissez-faire means let them be, don't help them. If we reach out and prevent the poor and the downtrodden and the weak from being crushed underfoot, well, who are we to get in the way of nature? Who are we to prevent nature taking its course and the negative consequences that befall those who are at the bottom of the heap? And then finally, and maybe most troublingly, though these are all pretty troubling, is concerns over differential breeding. If you're trying to make the best society, then you want it to be made up of the best people. As a result, you want the best people to be producing more of the kids. And you want the worst people, the unfit, to produce fewer of the kids. There are a lot of concerns in this era of society being overrun by all the breeding, all the babies that were happening at the bottom rungs of society. Those people are going to overrun our society, and we're going to be on our way down as a result. Now, social Darwinism is, as an ideology, a massive example of the naturalistic fallacy. You take a factual claim. This is mostly true. Maybe the wording is a little misleading, but this is mostly true. This is a factual claim about evolution, but you use it to determine a moral claim that survival of the fittest is good, and then you use that to determine how we should organize our society. So you let your factual claim determine your moral claim. An is-ought problem, and in particular the type of is-ought problem that we're talking about mainly in this course, which is the naturalistic fallacy. And it was an enormously consequential fallacy indeed. This idea of social Darwinism started us on the road down to eugenics. Now, eugenics itself as a term was coined by the statistician and philosopher Francis Galton, who happened to be the half-cousin of Darwin. Galton was obsessed with measuring human variation, how there were individual differences among people. He actually contributed an enormous amount to our understanding of statistics. He discovered the idea of a normal distribution, that is a bell curve. If you measure the heights of a whole bunch of humans, what you'll find, they cluster in a bell curve with most people being of average height. And then as you get more and more extreme to the shorter, taller end, you get fewer and fewer people. So it makes a nice distribution, a bell curve. But he was especially interested in this idea of eminence, which we would today call something like intelligence or competence. And what he found was that eminence seemed to, through his measurements, run in families. Those who have smart, competent parents tend to be smart and competent themselves and tend to leave smart and competent children. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for that. He focused on that being a genetic outcome. And his conclusion, now jumping to the way we should organize our societies, is that, well, if we want to make our society full of eminent people, then those people who are producing eminent children, well, we should incentivize them to have as many children as possible. And those people who are making less eminent children, well, we should maybe discourage them somehow, maybe gently, maybe not, from having children themselves. And that was eugenics, the deliberate hereditary improvement of the race. Eugenics itself, it comes from the prefix eu meaning good and genics meaning born or origin, so it's well born. And it comes in two varieties. One is positive eugenics, where you encourage the fit to breed as much as possible. So you encourage those whom you want to breed to do so. Maybe what you do is you take people who are already in eminent pairs and you say, we'll pay you a ton of money or give you a great house to have your kids. Or what you do is you take the most eminent people in your society and you mush them together until they start spitting out children. Fine. Then there's the more sinister negative eugenics, where instead of incentivizing the good people to breed, you disincentivize the unfit from breeding. And you can do that. Maybe you pay them not to breed. That would be the nicest way to do it. There are less nice ways of doing it. Now, to his credit, Darwin was against eugenics entirely. He thought that positive eugenics was impractical because actually Darwin was a bit of a romantic. He was actually quite a romantic. He thought that you can't just try to pair people together because people follow their hearts in choosing their partners. He certainly did. He married one of his cousins, not this cousin, but a different cousin, recognizing the risks that had, but he married her for love. And then negative eugenics, he thought, was morally reprehensible. The mainstream position among intellectuals and politicians, including among progressive liberal politicians, including many feminists, was eugenics was a good thing. It's hard for us to look back now at that history, but here's how some of it went. So early in the century in France, IQ testing, the quantitative measurement of intelligence, had been introduced to measure IQ in children, but very quickly started being adapted for testing adults, and in particular testing racial differences between adults. That started being applied to discussions about immigration policy. In 1924, in the United States, President Coolidge signed the Immigration Act, which limited immigration from these races deemed to be genetically inferior. That was a policy which stood until it was repealed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965. But there were worse things than just not letting in immigrants, and that was in the form of forced sterilizations. Now, there had been forced sterilization laws on the books in some U.S. states, including Indiana, from pretty early on in the century, but it had been poorly enacted because of legal murkiness. The shift happened with a famous Supreme Court case in 1927 called Buck versus Bell, where Carrie Buck was a pregnant woman who was deemed to be feeble-minded and had a mother who was also deemed to be feeble-minded. The Supreme Court ruled that compulsory non-consensual sterilization was required for the feeble-minded. That's what opened the floodgates. By 1935, 30 states had those types of laws, and they began to be heavily enforced, particularly in California. Now, before we get on our moral high horse, being Canadians and morally superior to the United States, there were two provinces which passed around the same time sexual sterilization laws in Canada. One of them was Alberta, and I'll give you guys one guess as to what the second one was, but its name rhymes with the name of our university. Those laws were on the books until the 70s. In the end, more than 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized. Again, most of them in California. Another 3,000 in Alberta, several hundred in BC. Adolf Hitler actually learned about and sent his scientists to learn about sterilization from American scientists during the 30s. So you can sadly draw a direct line from Darwin through the American eugenics movement to Hitler and his final solution in the Holocaust. And it's that ugly history that formed the backdrop of why people have such problems with evolutionary thinking, and particularly evolutionary psychology thinking. It was the horrible extent that eugenics had reached that prompted this backlash in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and all the way carrying up to today within academia and in culture more largely. Theorists rejected biological explanations and instead took a blank slatist approach where they emphasized that everything had to be determined by cultural learning. They swung the pendulum away from the type of thinking that had preceded them and that had led to the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust. So it's against that background that sociobiology, the predecessor of evolutionary psychology, and then later evolutionary psychology emerge. And many in and out of academia are perhaps understandably thus suspicious that there is a similar political agenda behind evolutionary psychology as we saw in the past. And this has led to a lot of resistance to evolutionary psychology's claims. But there's another side to this. So, whereas the political appropriation of evolutionary science stains its history, the denial of the science, because of political motivations, also has its dark side. The Americans were motivated to reinforce a competitive capitalist status quo. The Germans were motivated to reinforce an essentialist racial hierarchy. But in the Soviet Union, there was a different ideology. There was an attempt to reinforce an idea of the working man, of the proletariat, and that led them to a different relationship with evolutionary thinking. Whereas the Americans and the Germans allowed their science to guide their politics, in the Soviet Union, they allowed the politics to shape the science. And here's where we have to introduce one last character, and that's the agronomist Trofim Lysenko, also known as the worst scientist in history. Now, Lysenko was born to a peasant family, but he worked his way up to become an agricultural scientist. Now, at the time, most in that field were experimenting with Mendelian genetics and influenced by Darwinian theories of evolution, but Lysenko rejected all of that in favor of his own view of genetics, which was more ideologically aligned with communist philosophies. So he downplayed capitalist sounding things like natural selection. He downplayed heredity and competition, and instead he upplated the more communist sounding things like genes providing mutual assistance for each other. He also made outrageous and fraudulent claims about the effects that his theories had on actual food production. The consequence is that his own proletariat background, his own working man story, coupled with telling them exactly what they wanted to hear, earned the favor of the Soviet politicians, and in particular Stalin. And so he was promoted higher and higher up until he was given the position of the top geneticist in the country, a position that he used to silence dissent, silence other theories of genetics, which happen to be the correct theories of genetics, and actually silence and disappear many of his critics, as well as just people with different scientific ideas. Now, the consequence of that, the consequence that the most powerful man behind genetics and agricultural policy in the country had scientifically groundless ideas, baseless, incorrect ideas, meant that there were massive food shortages. The fact that these were also picked up in Maoist China just compounded the scope of the problem. The consequence is that without all that food, there was mass starvation. Tens of millions of people died. That was the consequence of politically motivated science denial, a tragedy of really unimaginable scope and suffering. So, what do we take from this? Well, first, we have to guard ourselves against the naturalistic fallacy. We have to make sure we don't conflate facts and values. They don't, on their own, necessitate each other. If you're going to have a moral position, it has to be based on moral argument, not simply that things are a certain way. And also, and this is explained fairly nicely in the Stuart Williams reading for this week, is you can't let your view of what is true be shaped by the way you wish things ought to be, because that gets in the way of actually accomplishing what you want. You need to have a realistic view of the world in order to actually achieve the goals that are motivated by your morals. Second, science often gets it wrong. The whole history of science is it being wrong and being corrected, and so we need to be open to the criticism in a way that Lysenko wasn't. But finally, we have to be aware of criticism with an interest, with a non-scientific motivation. That's the story of this lecture. There are many political agendas that are always circulating. We need to judge science on the basis of the science, removed from those moral or metaphysical or political objections.